At 2:34 a.m. on November 8, 1950, Corporal James Jimmy Hale lay motionless in a collapsed irrigation ditch 3 miles south of the Chongchon River, watching 47 Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers move through the frozen rice paddies 165 yards to his northeast. He had exactly 4 arrows left in his hand-stitched leather quiver and 1 hunting knife strapped to his boot. The nearest American position was a full 940 yards behind him, a machine gun nest on Hill 219 that had gone silent 12 minutes ago. In the next 3 minutes and 40 seconds, he would kill 11 men without making a sound loud enough to wake a sleeping infant, using a weapon that hadn't seen combat since the 100 Years' War. This was the night that proved the most lethal weapon in the Korean winter wasn't issued by the Pentagon. It was carved from ash wood in the Appalachian foothills by a 23-year-old dropout who'd never passed a single Army marksmanship test. The wind carried their voices across the frozen wasteland, Mandarin mixed with Korean dialects. Hale didn't speak either language, but he understood the universal sound of men who believed they'd already won. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. His breath came in controlled, invisible wisps. Most soldiers would be shaking violently by now. Most soldiers weren't raised in a tar paper shack in eastern Kentucky, where winter meant choosing between food and firewood. They'd laughed at him during basic training at Fort Knox. The hillbilly with the Robin Hood complex, they'd called him. When he'd requested permission to carry his grandfather's recurve bow into combat, the supply sergeant had literally fallen off his chair laughing. "What's next, son? A goddamn slingshot? This is modern warfare. We got jets, we got napalm, we got the atomic bomb, for Christ's sake." But now, pressed into the frozen mud of North Korea, with his M1 Garand long since emptied and abandoned 2 clicks back, with Chinese winter offensive pouring over the hills like a human avalanche, with his entire platoon scattered or dead or captured, now the bow didn't seem so funny. The lead Chinese scout paused. Hale watched him through eyes so narrow they were barely slits. The man was searching, head swiveling, rifle at the ready. He was good, trained, alert. In 90 seconds, he would be dead, and he would never know what killed him. This is the story of how James Hale became a ghost. How a weapon, banned from modern combat, became the most feared thing in the mountains of North Korea. How mockery turned to legend in one frozen November night. Some say it never happened. The official records are incomplete, convenient gaps, redacted sections. But the men who survived the Chongchon River withdrawal, the ones who made it past the Chinese roadblocks in the chaos of late 1950, they whispered his name in field hospitals and transport ships. Hale, the hunter, the silent killer, the man who moved through enemy lines like smoke, leaving bodies that confused Chinese commanders for weeks. The Pentagon didn't want this story told. It complicated things. How do you admit that your modern army, your trillion-dollar war machine, was saved, even partially, by a semi-literate mountain boy with a stick and string? But the truth has a way of surfacing. 60 years later, in a nursing home in Hazard, Kentucky, an 83-year-old Chinese veteran named Chen Wei would tell his grandson about the American demon who hunted in the dark. We called him Gui Jian, the ghost arrow. We found 15 of our men dead in one valley. No bullet wounds, just arrows. like something from the ancient dynasties. It terrified us more than their artillery. At least artillery you could hear coming. This is that story. The classified file. The legend that the Army tried to bury, but couldn't quite kill. James Hale was born on February 14th, 1927, in a hollow so remote it didn't have a name, just a rough direction given to the occasional revenue agent or social worker. About 8 miles up past Dewey Spurlock's place, where the creek forks left. His father, Thomas Hale, died in a mine collapse when Jimmy was 4. His mother, Sarah, died of pneumonia when he was 7. He was raised by his grandfather, Ezekiel Hale, a man who had been old when Jimmy was born and seemed carved from the same ancient oak trees that covered the mountains. Ezekiel had fought in the First World War, a fact that surprised the few who knew him because he never spoke of it, and he'd never fired a gun there. He'd been in the trenches at Belleau Wood, but as a runner, carrying messages through artillery barrages while others shot and died. When he came back to Kentucky, he never touched a rifle again. Too loud, was all he'd say. Draws too much attention. Spooks the game. Instead, Ezekiel hunted the old way. The way his Cherokee grandmother had taught him before the removal, before Oklahoma, back when some families still hid in the deepest hollows. He used a bow made from ash, strung with deer sinew, arrows fletched with turkey feathers. He could kill a deer at 60 yards in near darkness. He could wait motionless for 4 hours for a shot. He wasted nothing. Jimmy learned at his grandfather's knee. Not from words, Ezekiel wasn't much for talking, but from watching, from endless repetition, from hunger when he missed, and fullness when he didn't. By age 10, Jimmy could track a wounded rabbit through a half-mile of forest. By 12, he could identify which tree a squirrel would jump to before the squirrel knew. By 15, he'd forgotten that most people hunted any other way. School was different. School was failure, printed on paper, and handed back with red marks. Jimmy couldn't parse the meaning from those dancing letters, couldn't make the numbers behave. His teachers assumed he was stupid. His classmates knew it for certain. Retard Jimmy, they called him. Can't even read a damn primer. He lasted until 10th grade before he stopped showing up. No one noticed. No one cared. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that Jimmy's brain worked differently. He thought in space, in movement, in the geometric poetry of trajectory and wind, and the precise angle where string tension became arrow flight. Show him a textbook, and his mind went blank. Put him in a forest, and he could calculate shots that would make a physicist weep. In 1945, when the war ended, Jimmy was 18 and working odd jobs, hauling timber, fixing fences, doing anything that paid enough to keep his grandfather fed. Ezekiel was 91 by then, bent like a question mark, his hands too twisted with arthritis to draw a bow. He died in his sleep in March of 1946. Jimmy found him in the morning, looking peaceful for the first time in years. The funeral was small. The will was smaller. Jimmy inherited a .22 rifle that didn't work, $17, and his grandfather's bow. The bow was what mattered. For 4 years, Jimmy drifted. He worked timber operations in West Virginia. He tried coal mining, lasted 3 days before the darkness, and the walls sent him scrambling back to the surface. He moved through small towns, sleeping in boarding houses or cars, always returning to the mountains, always hunting. The bow kept him fed when money ran out. In June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. President Truman called it a police action. The draft boards called it an opportunity. Jimmy's number came up in August. He reported to the processing center in Prestonsburg, skinny and silent, carrying a paper bag with 2 changes of clothes, and, inexplicably, his grandfather's bow. "What the hell is that?" the intake sergeant asked. "Sir, it's a bow." "I can see that, son. Why the hell did you bring it?" Jimmy didn't have a good answer. He just knew he couldn't leave it behind. It was all he had left, all he knew how to use. "Well, you can't bring it to basic training. This is the United States Army, not the goddamn medieval times." They sent him to Fort Knox in Kentucky. Basic training was a nightmare. Jimmy couldn't march in step. His rhythm was off, always a half-second behind. He couldn't memorize the serial numbers and regulations. And he couldn't, for the love of God or country, shoot a rifle accurately. The M1 Garand was a beautiful weapon, reliable, powerful, accurate in the right hands. Jimmy's hands were not the right hands. He flinched before every shot. The recoil hurt his shoulder. The noise made him freeze. During qualification, he scored 142 out of a possible 250. Marksman required 190. He was the worst shot in his company. "Hale, what the hell is wrong with you?" Drill Sergeant Morrison screamed after the 3rd failed qualification. "My grandmother could shoot better than you, and she's been dead for 10 years. "I'm sorry, Sergeant. Sorry doesn't kill communists, Private. You think Kim Il-sung gives a damn about sorry?" The other recruits found it hilarious. Here was this scrawny hillbilly who'd probably never seen indoor plumbing, and he couldn't even shoot straight. The jokes were endless. "Hey, Hale, maybe if you ask real nice, the Chinese'll just stand still while you figure out which end of the rifle to use." Laughter. Always laughter. Jimmy took it quietly. He'd been the butt of jokes his whole life. This was nothing new. But at night, lying in his bunk, he'd think about the bow locked in his duffel in the storage room. 28 pounds of draw weight, 62 inches, tip to tip. Arrows that flew silent and true. A weapon he understood in his bones, in his blood, in ways the rifle would never make sense. Private First Class Dennis Kowalski noticed him sketching one evening in the barracks. Jimmy was drawing arrows, not cartoon arrows, but technical diagrams showing fletching angles, nock placement, broadhead designs. "What's all that?" Kowalski asked. He was from Chicago, smart, destined for officer training. "Just thinking," Jimmy said. Kowalski studied the drawings. "These are really precise. You do archery or something?" "Used to, for hunting." "Huh. You're terrible with a rifle, but you can draw like an engineer?" Kowalski wasn't mocking. He seemed genuinely curious. "You ever think maybe you're just built for a different kind of fighting?" Jimmy shrugged. "Army don't see it that way." "Army don't see a lot of things," Kowalski said quietly. He'd become disillusioned fast. "My uncle fought in the Pacific. He said half the time, the manual doesn't match what actually works. He said the best soldiers were the ones who adapted." It was the first kind thing anyone had said to Jimmy since he'd arrived. He didn't forget it. In October, Jimmy barely passed basic training. They needed bodies in Korea too badly to fail anyone who could walk and follow basic orders. He was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division, Baker Company, 23rd Infantry Regiment. They shipped out on October 19th. The sea voyage took 2 weeks. Jimmy spent most of it seasick, hanging over the rail, watching the endless gray Pacific, and wondering what the hell he'd gotten into. They landed at Pusan on November 1st. The war was supposedly winding down. MacArthur had launched his brilliant Incheon invasion in September, cutting North Korean supply lines and sending their army reeling north. The official word was that everyone would be home by Christmas. The 2nd Division was moving north to mop up resistance and secure positions near the Chinese border. Someone forgot to tell the Chinese. The battalion reached positions south of the Chongchon River on November 6th. The landscape was alien to Jimmy, flat in places, then sudden steep hills, everything turning brown and dead as winter approached. The rice paddies were freezing over at night. The temperature dropped every day. Lieutenant Michael Strathmore commanded Jimmy's platoon. He was a West Point graduate, 25 years old, convinced of both American superiority and his own tactical genius. He looked at his roster the first night and saw Jimmy's qualification scores. "Hale, you're the one who can't shoot?" "Yes, sir." "Wonderful. Just what I need. Try not to shoot any of our own guys, will you?" More laughter from the other men. Jimmy just nodded. The platoon set up defensive positions on Hill 219, overlooking a valley with a small village and multiple approach routes. They dug for holes in the frozen ground, miserable work that took hours. They set up machine gun nests and mortar positions. They waited. Corporal Eddie Martinez was Jimmy's Fajol mate. He was from El Paso, loud and friendly in the way of men who couldn't stand silence. He talked constantly about his girlfriend back home, about cars, about how cold it was, about everything. "So what's your story, Hale? You don't talk much." "Not much to tell?" "Where you from?" "Kentucky." "Mountains." "Like Louisville?" "No. Other side, smaller." Martinez laughed. "Man, you're like pulling teeth. You ever even talk?" "When I got something to say." "Fair enough." Martinez lit a cigarette, cupping it against the wind. "You really can't shoot?" "That's what everyone's saying." Jimmy shrugged. "I can shoot, just not with a rifle." "What's that mean?" Jimmy hesitated, then figured what the hell. They'd all find out eventually anyway. "I hunt with a bow. Back home. Been doing it since I was a kid." Martinez nearly choked on his cigarette. "A bow? Like Indians?" "Like hunters." "Shit, man, that's actually kind of cool. You any good?" "Good enough." "So why don't you use it here?" "Army don't allow it." "Yeah, well, Army don't allow a lot of things that make sense." Martinez grinned. "You still got it? The bow?" "Yeah, in my pack." "You smuggled a bow to Korea?" Martinez started laughing, not meanly, but with genuine delight. "That's the craziest thing I've heard all week. I love it. Don't tell Strathmore. He'd probably have you court-martialed." They settled into a routine. Days of watching empty valleys, nights of freezing watch duty, patrols that found nothing. The Chinese were supposedly far to the north. Intelligence said they wouldn't cross the Yalu River. Intelligence said a lot of things. On November 7th, everything changed. The attack came at dusk. Not from the north, where they expected, from the east, from positions that weren't supposed to exist. Thousands of Chinese soldiers moving in coordinated waves, bugles blaring, whistles shrieking. Human wave attacks that ignored casualties. and just kept coming. Hill 219 held for 4 hours. The machine guns fired until the barrels glowed red. Mortars dropped until ammunition ran out. Men fired their M1s until their thumbs bled from the end block clips. And still they came. Lieutenant Strathmore called for retreat at 10:47 p.m. By then, the platoon had lost 19 men killed, 7 wounded too badly to move. They fell back in chaos, in darkness. Chinese forces pushing hard from multiple directions. Jimmy ran with the others. His rifle was empty. He'd fired all 8 rounds in the general direction of the enemy and had no idea if he'd hit anything. Martinez was beside him, breathing hard. Strathmore was screaming orders that no one could hear over the gunfire. They made it 3 miles before they hit another Chinese position. An ambush. Muzzle flashes in the darkness, men screaming. Confusion, the platoon scattered. Jimmy ran left, into a frozen rice paddy, slipped on the ice, went down hard. When he looked up, Martinez was gone. Everyone was gone. He was alone. He crawled into an irrigation ditch, pressed himself against the frozen mud, and waited. Chinese soldiers passed within feet of him, sweeping the area. He held his breath, waited, survived. By the time the sun rose on November 8th, Jimmy was miles behind enemy lines. He had his M1 Garand with no ammunition. He had 2 canteens, half frozen. He had 3 protein bars. He had his knife. And he had his pack, which contained his grandfather's bow and 12 arrows. The laughter from basic training echoed in his mind. A bow in modern warfare. How quaint, how useless. Jimmy pulled the bow from his pack and ran his hand along the smooth ash wood. Ezekiel's voice came back to him. This has fed our family for 40 years. It's put meat on the table when money couldn't. Never mock a tool that works. He had no choice now. The rifle was a club. The bow was a weapon. That's when Jimmy Hale stopped being a failed soldier and became something else. Something the Army had never trained for. Something the Chinese had never encountered. He became a hunter. The first kill came almost by accident. November 8th, 7:23 a.m. Jimmy was moving south, trying to find American lines, when he heard voices. 2 Chinese soldiers sitting beside a small fire, cooking something in a tin pot. They were young, laughing. Their rifles leaned against a tree 6 feet away. Jimmy crouched behind a low-rise, watching them. In a normal situation, he'd wait until they left, then move around them. But he was starving. That fire meant food. Those rifles meant ammunition. Even if it was the wrong caliber, they might have grenades, medical supplies, maps. He thought about what Ezekiel would do. His grandfather had taught him about hunting men once, though they'd never called it that. Sometimes you got to deal with revenue agents, Ezekiel had said. Men with guns looking for stills in the mountains. You don't want to fight them. You hang back, you wait, you make them nervous. You let the forest do the work. A nervous man makes mistakes. But these soldiers weren't nervous. They were relaxed, confident, occupying what they believed was secure territory. Jimmy knocked an arrow, drew back the string, that familiar, perfect resistance. Found his anchor point by feel, not sight, breathed out slowly. The left soldier turned his head at the exact wrong moment. The arrow took him in the throat, just above the collarbone. He made a sound, a wet, choking gasp, and fell sideways into the fire. The second soldier jumped up, confused, reaching for his rifle. Jimmy's second arrow hit him in the chest, punching through his quilted uniform and into his heart. He dropped without a sound. Jimmy waited 5 full minutes before moving. Listened for other voices, other movement. Nothing. Just wind and the crackling fire. He approached carefully. Both men were dead. The arrows had done their work. Brutal, efficient, silent. Jimmy felt nothing. Killing an animal was harder than this. These men would have killed him without hesitation. He pulled his arrows free, cleaned them on the dead soldiers' uniforms, checked their supplies, found rice, dried fish, a thermos of hot tea, found grenades, found a pistol with ammunition, found a map covered in Chinese characters he couldn't read. He ate their food and moved on. The second kill came that afternoon. A lone sentry, standing watch on a ridgeline. Jimmy approached from downwind, moving through scrub brush with the patience of a man who'd stalked white-tailed deer through autumn leaves. The sentry never knew he was there. Arrow through the back, between the shoulder blades, angled up into the lung. The man coughed once and fell forward. The third and fourth kills came at dusk. 2 soldiers checking a destroyed American truck, looking for salvage. Jimmy hit the first from 80 yards. An impossible shot by any standard. But the wind was still, and Jimmy had been making impossible shots since he was 12. The second soldier spun around, confused, searching. Jimmy's arrow caught him in the neck before he could process what was happening. By nightfall, on November 8th, Jimmy had killed 6 Chinese soldiers. No gunshots, no noise. Just silent death from angles they never expected. But it was the cluster of soldiers at 2:34 a.m. that would become legend. Jimmy had been moving south all day, parallel to what he thought was the Chinese advance. His plan, if you could call it a plan, was to slip past their lines, find American positions, rejoin the war in some official capacity. But at 2:19 a.m., he heard engines. Truck engines, multiple vehicles, moving slowly on a frozen road about half a click to his east. He crawled to a low ridge and watched through the darkness. A convoy, 4 trucks, maybe 50 soldiers total, plus equipment. They were setting up a temporary position, spreading out into a valley, establishing a command post. Jimmy should have kept moving, should have gone around them, but something made him stop. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was anger at how easily the Chinese had overrun American positions. Maybe it was the memory of Martinez's face as the platoon scattered. Maybe it was just that he'd been ignored and mocked his entire life, and here, finally, was something he could do better than anyone. He found the irrigation ditch, settled in, and watched them organize. They were good soldiers, disciplined, efficient. They posted sentries at cardinal directions. They set up a radio. Officers gathered around a map with flashlights. 47 soldiers. 4 arrows left. That was the math. Any sane person would have crawled away into the darkness. Jimmy pulled out his knife and started sharpening the broadheads. At 2:34 a.m., the first sentry rotation began. Jimmy watched the new sentry walk to his position on the perimeter, a small rise overlooking the frozen rice paddy. He was 40 yards from the main group, alone, smoking a cigarette. Jimmy drew his bow. The sentry died with his cigarette still between his lips, an arrow through his chest, falling backward into the darkness. No one noticed. Night watches were boring. Men nodded off, wandered away to piss, stared at nothing. One missing sentry wasn't unusual yet. Jimmy moved, not toward the body, but laterally, using the ditch for cover. He reached the fallen sentry, pulled his arrow free, took the man's rifle and ammunition, moved again. The second sentry was on the opposite side of the perimeter, 55 yards. Darkness was total, but Jimmy didn't need light. He'd hunted by moonlight and starlight his whole life. He knew where the target was by sound, by intuition, by a sense that city people never developed. The arrow flew true. The sentry collapsed. Now Jimmy had 2 arrows left and a Chinese rifle he barely knew how to use. But he also had something else, a growing understanding of their pattern. These weren't frontline assault troops. They were support, logistics, command staff. They were relaxed. They'd been advancing for days without serious resistance. They felt safe. Jimmy crawled to within 30 yards of the command post. He could see officers inside, silhouettes against a lamp. He could hear radios crackling in Chinese. He counted 19 men in the immediate area. He nocked his 3rd arrow, chose his target carefully. An officer standing outside the command post, gesturing to 2 subordinates. The arrow took him in the throat. He went down gurgling, hands at his neck. The 2 subordinates froze for a critical second, trying to understand what had happened. Jimmy put his 4th and final arrow into the nearest subordinate. The man screamed, not loudly, but enough. The camp stirred. Men shouted questions. Flashlights came on. Jimmy dropped the bow and brought up the Chinese rifle. He'd never fired one, didn't know its kick or its sights, but at 30 yards in semi-darkness, accuracy mattered less than volume. He fired 3 quick shots into the command post, shattering the lamp, hitting at least 1 body. Men screamed. Chaos erupted. Jimmy ran. Not away from them, but toward them, the one direction they wouldn't expect. He sprinted through the perimeter, past confused soldiers who were still trying to figure out where the attack was coming from. He grabbed a grenade from a supply crate, pulled the pin, threw it toward the radio truck. The explosion lit the night, scattered men like leaves. Now they were firing, but at shadows, at each other, at nothing. Jimmy had vanished into the darkness beyond their position. He circled, came at them from a new angle. The Chinese rifle barked again. 2 more soldiers down. The engagement lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes of controlled chaos. Jimmy moved through the darkness like something inhuman, hitting them from multiple angles, creating the illusion of a larger force. Every shot he took, he moved. Every position he fired from, he abandoned. The Chinese fired thousands of rounds into the darkness. They hit each other more than they hit Jimmy. Panic spread like infection. "There's Americans everywhere!" someone shouted in Mandarin. A lieutenant ordered retreat. Another officer countermanded the order. Communication broke down. Jimmy ran out of ammunition for the rifle, dropped it, drew his knife, came up behind a soldier, firing blindly into the rice paddy, and opened his throat. The man fell without a sound. Jimmy took his rifle, his grenades, kept moving. By 2:46 a.m., 12 minutes after the first arrow, the Chinese position was in full collapse. They were retreating, carrying wounded, abandoning equipment, their command structure shattered. They'd been attacked by an entire squad, maybe a platoon. At least, that's what they believed. Jimmy watched them flee from his position in the irrigation ditch, He counted bodies. 11 dead, at least 15 wounded, badly enough that they had to be carried. He'd done that. One man, 4 arrows, and borrowed ammunition. He waited until they were gone, then scavenged. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, 2 grenades, and, miraculously, his 4 arrows, which he pulled from bodies and cleaned meticulously. They were precious now. They represented something more than just hunting tools. As dawn broke on November 9th, Jimmy continued south. He was no longer running. He was hunting. Over the next 6 days, as the 2nd Infantry Division fought a desperate withdrawal south from the Chinese winter offensive, reports came in that confused intelligence officers. November 9th, a Chinese supply column ambushed south of Kunuri. 4 soldiers dead, 3 wounded, no shell casings found, no explosion craters, just arrows. Medieval arrows, apparently. Had the North Koreans started using bows? Was this some kind of guerrilla tactic? November 10th. 2 Chinese scouts found dead near Suncheon. Same pattern. Arrows. Broadhead wounds. One had been killed from over 70 yards away. An impossible shot with primitive weapons, according to the forensics team. November 11th. A Chinese forward observer position eliminated. 3 dead, their radio destroyed. The guards reported seeing nothing, hearing nothing. Just suddenly their comrades were dead with arrows in them. Ghost stories started circulating. November 13th. A Chinese captain's diary was recovered from a battlefield. The entry from November 12th read, translated, "Our men are terrified of the night. They speak of a spirit in the mountains who kills without sound. 15 of our soldiers have been found with arrows through their hearts, their throats, their spines. The Americans claim ignorance. Our own commanders think we are shooting each other in the darkness. But I have seen the wounds. These are not bullets, these are arrows, perfectly placed, impossibly accurate. We are being hunted." By November 14th, the Chinese had a name for him, Guijian, the ghost arrow. Some units refused night patrols. Sentries bunched together instead of spreading out, making them less effective, but feeling safer. Morale took a measurable dip in several battalions. American intelligence noticed the pattern, but couldn't explain it. Lieutenant Colonel Morris Abrams, the Division G2 intelligence officer, studied the reports with growing confusion. "We don't have any archer units," he said to his assistant. "That's not a thing. That's not been a thing for 500 years. Could it be a North Korean? Some kind of resistance fighter? With that accuracy? That kill count? This is professional work." Abrams stared at the map, at the pattern of incidents. And they were all along the withdrawal route. It's like someone's clearing a path. On November 14th, at a checkpoint south of Anju, Jimmy finally reached American lines. He walked out of the darkness at 11:30 p.m., hands raised, shouting the day's password. The sentries nearly shot him anyway. He looked like a ghoul, covered in mud and dried blood, eyes sunken, moving with the cautious gait of a wounded animal. "Identify yourself." "Corporal James Hale, Baker Company, 23rd Infantry." "Baker Company? They were overrun 6 days ago. You're supposed to be dead." "Got lost." They brought him to the battalion command post. Lieutenant Strathmore was there. He'd survived the initial attack, rallied a dozen men, and fought his way south. When he saw Jimmy walk in, his jaw dropped. "Hale? Holy shit, Hale! We thought you were captured or killed." "No, sir." "How the hell did you make it?" Jimmy shrugged. "Walked, mostly." "Through Chinese lines? For a week?" "Didn't see many. mostly stayed off the roads. Strathmore studied him. Jimmy was carrying a Chinese rifle, Chinese grenades, a Chinese officer's pistol. And on his back, impossible to miss, was a bow. A fucking bow. What is that? My grandfather's bow, sir. You've been carrying that this whole time? Yes, sir. Did you use it? Jimmy hesitated. Sometimes? The word spread through the checkpoint like wildfire. The hillbilly who couldn't shoot straight had walked through the Chinese army carrying a bow, like he was Robin Hood or something. The story got embellished with each telling. By morning, half the battalion had heard about it. Most thought it was a joke. Some thought it was propaganda to boost morale. Then intelligence got involved. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams interrogated Jimmy personally. He'd brought a map marked with all the incidents involving arrows. Corporal Hale, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Did you kill Chinese soldiers with a bow and arrow? Jimmy looked at the map, saw the marked locations. Some matched where he'd been. Some didn't. Some of those, sir, maybe 6 or 7. I wasn't counting. Abrams stared at him. You personally killed 6 or 7 enemy soldiers. With arrows. Yes, sir. And you made it through their lines for 6 days without being caught. Yes, sir. How? Jimmy didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell a lieutenant colonel that you learned to hunt? By watching a 90-year-old Cherokee descendant move through Kentucky mountains? That you understood territory in a way that maps couldn't capture? That you'd spent your whole life being invisible, overlooked, dismissed, and you'd learned to use that invisibility like a weapon? I'm good at moving quiet, sir. And the bow, they didn't expect it. No noise. They couldn't tell where shots came from. Abrams made notes. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted. Corporal, the 2nd Division is in full withdrawal. We've lost contact with multiple units. Chinese forces are everywhere, and we don't have good intelligence on their positions. We need scouts. We need people who can move through enemy territory without being detected. I'm not a scout, sir. I barely passed basic training. You survived a week behind enemy lines and killed enemy soldiers using a weapon that most people think belongs in a museum. I'd say you're more qualified than any scout I have. Abrams leaned forward. I'm attaching you to division reconnaissance. You'll operate independently, gathering intelligence and disrupting enemy operations. However you see fit. Sir, I don't know if... That's an order, Corporal. You just became the strangest weapon in my arsenal. For the next 3 weeks, as the 2nd Infantry Division retreated through North Korea in what would become known as the Gauntlet, Corporal James Hale operated alone in enemy territory. He was given a radio, which he rarely used. He was given maps, which he mostly ignored, preferring to move by terrain and intuition. He was given objectives, enemy positions to scout, supply lines to report on, headquarters to locate. But mostly, he was left alone to do what he did best, hunt. The Chinese never figured it out. They kept finding bodies, soldiers killed silently, efficiently, impossibly, sentries who never reported in, officers who died in their sleep, messengers who vanished between positions, supplies that were sabotaged, vehicles that wouldn't start because someone had silently destroyed critical parts. And arrows. Always arrows. Jimmy developed techniques. He learned that Chinese soldiers were superstitious about specific things. They feared ghosts. They feared dishonor. They feared omens. So he left omens. Arrows arranged in patterns around bodies. messages written in Chinese characters he copied from captured documents, probably saying nonsense but looking ominous. He moved bodies into positions that would be discovered at dawn, creating maximum psychological impact. It was psychological warfare conducted by a man who couldn't read past a sixth-grade level, but who understood fear in a way that generals never did. The Chinese started making mistakes. They diverted patrols to hunt for the ghost arrow instead of pursuing American forces. They bunched troops together for safety, making them better targets for American artillery. They abandoned forward positions at night, surrendering ground without a fight. By December 1st, the 2nd Infantry Division had successfully withdrawn to more defensible positions south of the 38th parallel. The casualties were enormous. The division had been mauled, reorganized, mauled again, but they'd survived. And according to intelligence assessments, one factor in that survival was the disruption caused to Chinese operations by an unidentified sniper using primitive weapons. Jimmy Hale was no longer laughed at. When he walked through camps, soldiers went quiet. Some saluted with genuine respect. Others just stared, trying to reconcile the quiet, skinny hillbilly with the stories they'd heard. Corporal Eddie Martinez found him on December 3rd. Jimmy was sitting outside a supply tent, carefully fletching new arrows from materials he'd scrounged. Bamboo shafts, metal scrap fashioned into broadheads, feathers from a dead chicken. Someone had been planning to cook. "Hale? Holy shit, man, you're alive." Jimmy looked up. Martinez had a bandage on his shoulder, walked with a slight limp, but was grinning. "Martinez, glad you made it." "Glad I made it." "Dude, you're the one who disappeared into Chinese-controlled territory for 3 weeks. Everyone said you were dead or captured." Martinez sat down beside him, watching him work. "These the arrows everyone's talking about?" "Yeah." "How many did you kill?" "With these?" Jimmy kept working. Didn't look up. "Don't know. Didn't keep count after a while. Intelligence says maybe 30. Maybe more." "Maybe." Martinez was quiet for a moment. Then, "They're calling you a legend, man. The ghost arrow, the hunter. There's Chinese prisoners who won't sleep because they think you're going to sneak into the camp and kill them in their bunks. That's stupid. Is it? You've been doing pretty much exactly that for 3 weeks." Jimmy tested the arrow's spine, checked the fletching alignment. They were the enemy. "That's what you're supposed to do. Not with a bow, man, not like some kind of medieval assassin. That's not in the manual. Manual didn't help much when we got overrun on Hill 219. Martinez couldn't argue with that. Fair point. He pulled out a cigarette, offered one to Jimmy. Jimmy shook his head. "So what happens now? You going to keep doing this? They giving you a medal or something?" "Don't know. Don't want a medal." "What do you want?" Jimmy thought about that. What did he want? To go home? To go back to the mountains where people left him alone? To forget the faces of men he'd killed in the darkness? "Just want it to be over," he said finally. But it wasn't over. The war would drag on for 2.5 more years, and Jimmy would be in it, doing what he did best, being the weapon that nobody wanted to acknowledge, but everyone was grateful for. December 15th, 1950. Division intelligence had received word of a high-value target, a Chinese colonel who was coordinating artillery strikes against American positions. He was supposedly operating from a village called Chisan Ni, about 8 miles north of UN lines. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams called Jimmy into his tent. "Hale, I have a job for you. Command wants this colonel eliminated. Can't send a patrol. Too much enemy activity in that sector. Can't call in an airstrike. Too many civilians in the village. But one man, moving quietly. You want me to kill him. I want you to do what you've been doing. Get in, eliminate the target, get out. No noise, no trace." Jimmy considered it. "What if I get caught?" "Then you were acting on your own, against orders. The Army will disavow any knowledge. You'll be listed as a deserter who went rogue." Abrams met his eyes. "I won't lie to you, Corporal. This is off the books. This is assassination, not combat. If you say no, I understand." Jimmy thought about his grandfather, about hunting in the mountains, about the moral clarity of killing for food versus killing for strategy. He thought about the men on Hill 219, about Martinez's wounded shoulder, about how many American soldiers would live if Chinese artillery coordination was disrupted. "I'll do it." He left at dusk on December 16th. Moved north through no man's land, through positions where Chinese and American forces traded artillery fire daily, but neither side pushed aggressively. He traveled at night, hid during the day, ate cold rations, drank from frozen streams. He reached Chisan Ni on the night of December 18th. The village was small, maybe 40 buildings clustered around a central square. The Chinese had taken it over, soldiers everywhere, supply trucks, a command post in what had been a school building. Jimmy watched from the hills for 6 hours, learning the patterns. Guard rotations, officer movements, where the colonel was based. The man was careful, stayed inside, surrounded by guards, only emerged twice in those 6 hours to inspect positions. This wasn't like the previous kills. This wasn't a lone sentry or a supply column. This was a hardened target in a controlled environment. This was the kind of mission that Special Forces trained for, and even they used explosives, suppressed firearms, coordinated teams. Jimmy had a bow, 8 arrows, and a knife. He waited until 3 a.m., when exhaustion and cold made guards sloppy. Then he moved down from the hills into the village, between buildings like a shadow with intent. The first guard died without a sound, arrow through the back of the skull at 15 feet. Jimmy recovered the arrow, hid the body behind a supply crate, moved deeper into the village. The second guard was smoking, leaning against a wall, half asleep. Jimmy's arrow caught him in the throat. The man slumped sideways, cigarette falling into the snow with a tiny hiss. The school building had 4 guards at the entrance, too many for silence. Jimmy pulled one of his captured grenades, crept to within 30 feet, threw it past the guards toward a truck. The explosion sent them running in that direction. Jimmy slipped through the unguarded door. Inside came, officers shouting, soldiers grabbing weapons, confusion. Jimmy moved through darkened hallways, following the sound of authority. A voice barking orders, organizing response. He found the colonel in a back room, surrounded by 3 officers, studying a map by lamplight. They hadn't heard Jimmy approach. They didn't know he was there until his first arrow took one of the officers through the chest. The colonel spun around, reaching for his pistol. Jimmy's second arrow hit him in the shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to spin him sideways, send the pistol clattering. The other 2 officers charged. Jimmy dropped the bow, drew his knife, met them in close quarters. The fighting was brutal, silent, intimate. Jimmy had never been trained for this. He'd grown up in a world where you shot deer from distance, not wrestled men in the dark. But desperation and instinct carried him through. One officer went down with the knife in his throat. The other got his hands around Jimmy's neck before Jimmy drove his thumb into the man's eye socket, making him scream and let go. The colonel was trying to reload his pistol with a wounded shoulder. Jimmy kicked it away, grabbed him by his uniform, slammed him against the wall. "You're American," the colonel said in broken English, blood on his lips. Jimmy didn't respond, pulled his knife. The colonel closed his eyes. One thrust. Quick. Efficient. The kind of kill you made on a wounded deer to end suffering. The colonel slumped to the floor. Jimmy recovered his arrows, his bow. Outside, the village was in full alert. 50 soldiers, maybe more, converging on the school building. He couldn't fight through that. Couldn't run through that. He went up instead, found stairs to the second floor, then a ladder to the roof. Climbed out into the freezing night air, lay flat on the tiles, and waited. Soldiers swept the building below, found the bodies, raised the alarm. But nobody looked up. Nobody expected the killer to still be there. Jimmy lay on that roof for 6 hours as dawn broke and soldiers searched the village. He pressed himself against the cold tiles, barely breathing, while Chinese forces tore apart every building, every alley, every possible hiding place, except the one he occupied. By noon, they'd concluded he'd escaped. Guards relaxed slightly. Jimmy waited until dusk, then climbed down, slipped through the perimeter, and vanished into the hills. He made it back to American lines on December 21st, exhausted, frostbitten, half dead from exposure. Abrams met him personally. The colonel? Dead. The others? 4 more. Guards and officers. Abrams nodded slowly. Chinese radio traffic went crazy 2 days ago. They think it was a commando raid. A whole team. They're implementing new security protocols, doubling guards, moving command posts. He looked at Jimmy with something like awe. One man did what they think required a platoon. Jimmy said nothing. He was past words, past pride, past anything except exhaustion. Get some rest, Corporal. You've earned it. January 1951 brought a thaw, not just in weather, but in the war itself. Chinese forces had overextended during their winter offensive. UN forces stabilized, reorganized, began pushing back. The immediate crisis passed. Jimmy was pulled from frontline operations and sent to rear areas to recover. He'd lost 20 pounds, had frostbite on 3 toes, and hadn't slept properly in weeks. The doctor said he needed rest, but rest brought something worse than combat: reflection. Jimmy started having nightmares, not about being killed, but about killing. Faces of men in the darkness, arrows appearing in their chests, the wet sound of broadheads hitting flesh. His grandfather had killed deer, rabbit, squirrel, animals that were food, necessity, survival. Jimmy had killed men, 50, 60, maybe 70 men, over the course of 2 months. Men with families, with lives, with futures he'd ended with ashwood arrows and cold steel. He tried talking to the chaplain. The chaplain praised his service, thanked him for his sacrifice, told him he'd saved American lives. It didn't help. He tried talking to other soldiers. They treated him like a celebrity, asking for stories, for details, for the thrill of violence secondhand. It made him sick. Only Martinez understood. "You think you're supposed to feel good about it," Martinez said one night, sharing a bottle of whiskey someone had smuggled in. You think because they were the enemy, because it was war, it's supposed to sit right in your stomach. It doesn't. Not if you're human. Then why do people act like I'm a hero? Because they need heroes. Because heroes make war make sense. But you know what you are, Hale. You're not a hero. You're a killer who happened to kill the right people at the right time. That's all any soldier is. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him. In February, Division Command offered Jimmy a promotion to sergeant and a transfer to a training unit, where he'd teach you reconnaissance and survival techniques. He turned it down. I wanted to go back to my company, he said. Hale, you can do more good training others. I want to do back to my company. They let him. Baker Company had been rebuilt with replacements and transferred to defensive positions near the 38th parallel. The war was settling into a stalemate, the lines hardening around the eventual armistice boundary. Jimmy went back to being just another soldier. He kept his bow, but he didn't use it. When the company went on patrol, he carried his M1 Garand like everyone else. He never fired it, but he carried it. The other men didn't know what to make of him. The legend and the reality didn't match. The ghost arrow was supposed to be larger than life, a warrior poet, a master of death. Instead, they got a quiet hillbilly who barely spoke, who flinched at loud noises, who spent his downtime whittling small animals from scrap wood. What happened to you? Lieutenant Strathmore asked once. You used to be, I don't know, different. Got tired, Jimmy said. Of what? Killing. Strathmore didn't push it. Nobody did. The war ground on around them. But Jimmy had checked out. He did his duty, followed orders, survived. But the hunter was gone, buried under the weight of what he'd done. The war officially ended on July 27th, 1953. With the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement, Jimmy Hale was rotated back to the United States in August, honorably discharged in September with a Bronze Star for valor that he never wore and barely looked at. He went back to Kentucky. Bought a small piece of land in the mountains with his military pay. Built a cabin with his own hands, rough but solid, the way his grandfather had taught him. He hunted for food, not sport. He traded venison for supplies at the general store in town. He didn't talk about the war. People knew, though. Small towns always know. Word had filtered back through military channels, through letters from other soldiers, through the way legends do. The locals treated him with cautious respect, like he was something dangerous that might go off if handled wrong. One fall evening, in 1955, a man showed up at Jimmy's cabin. He was Chinese, about 60, with careful eyes and a pronounced limp. He introduced himself in broken English as Chen Wei, a retired Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldier who'd immigrated to San Francisco after the war. I had to see you, Chen Wei said. I had to know if you were real. Don't know what you mean. Guijian, the ghost arrow. I was there. In November 1950, south of the Chongchan River. My unit. We lost 15 men to arrows in 1 week. We thought we were going insane. Then we found your arrows, and we knew. Jimmy didn't respond, didn't confirm, or deny, just waited. I'm not here for revenge, Chen Wei continued. I'm here to understand. Why arrows? Why hunt men like animals? Jimmy thought about that for a long time. Finally, it was what I knew. It was all I had. It terrified us. Bullets. We understood. Explosions. We understood. But arrows in the dark, from nowhere, hitting with perfect accuracy, that was something from nightmares. Something old. Something that should not exist in modern war. War doesn't care about should or shouldn't. Chen Wei nodded slowly. You know what they say now, in China, among veterans? They say the Americans had a demon. A spirit of the old warriors who refused to die, who came back to punish invaders. They use your story to frighten new soldiers. Fight honorably, or Gui Jian will find you. I'm not a demon. I'm just a man who did what he had to. Perhaps, but men become myths when they do impossible things. Chen Wei stood, bowed slightly. I came to see if myths bleed, if legends feel regret. I have my answer. He left. Jimmy never saw him again. Years passed. The cabin grew older, weathered by mountain winters. Jimmy grew older too, his hair turning gray, his hands developing the same arthritis that had crippled his grandfather. He never married, never had children, never spoke about Korea except once, to a documentary filmmaker who tracked him down in 1998. What do you want people to know about what you did? The filmmaker asked. Jimmy thought about it. Thought about the laughter in basic training, about the impossible feat in the irrigation ditch, about the colonel bleeding out on a schoolhouse floor. I want them to know that legends are made of desperation, not glory. I want them to know that every arrow I shot hit a person, not a target. I want them to know that being good at killing doesn't make you a good person. The filmmaker's face fell. That's not very inspiring. Don't care about inspiring. Care about honest. The documentary never aired. The footage sat in an archive until after Jimmy's death. James Jimmy Hale died on December the 3rd, 2009. In his cabin. In his sleep. He was 82 years old. There was no funeral service. He'd specified in his will that he didn't want one. His body was cremated, his ashes spread in the mountains he'd loved. His bow, his grandfather's bow, the weapon that had killed at least 60 Chinese soldiers and created a legend that terrified an army, was donated to the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of American History. It sits in a climate-controlled case in a back room, cataloged but rarely displayed. The placard reads, Recurve Hunting Bow, Ashwood, circa 1880s, used by Corporal James Hale, 2nd Infantry Division, Korean War, 1950-1951. One of the last documented uses of archery in modern combat. Donor, Estate of J. Hale. The placard doesn't mention the bodies, doesn't mention the nightmares, doesn't mention the way fear spreads through an army when men start dying from weapons that belong to another age. But in veteran circles, in military history forums, in the quiet conversations between old soldiers who understand that war is never as simple as heroes and villains, the story persists. They still call him Gui Jian, the ghost arrow, the hunter who reminded the world that the oldest weapons in the right hands are still the deadliest. The official U.S. Army records from the Korean War are extensive, detailed, and carefully maintained. In those records, Corporal James Hale is listed as having served with the 2nd Infantry Division from November 1950 to August 1953. He was awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Korean Service Medal with 2 campaign stars. His service was classified as distinguished. There is no mention of arrows, no mention of unconventional weapons, no mission reports detailing assassinations deep behind enemy lines. The records that Lieutenant Colonel Abrams supposedly kept were either destroyed or remain classified somewhere in Pentagon basements, if they ever existed at all. The Chinese military archives are even more opaque. There are references to psychological warfare operations and irregular combatants in reports from late 1950, but specifics are vague, contradictory. Some historians have theorized that the Arrow Killer, if he existed, was actually a team of North Korean partisans using guerrilla tactics, and the legend of a single American soldier was propaganda or misattribution. But then, there are the letters, dozens of them, written by American soldiers who served in Korea, found in attics and storage units decades later. Letters that mention Hale the Hunter. Letters that describe arrows appearing in enemy soldiers. Letters that speak of a quiet hillbilly who couldn't shoot a rifle, but who killed with a weapon from another century. And there are the Chinese veterans, now in their 80s and 90s, living in Beijing and Shanghai and rural villages, who still remember, who still flinch when they hear about archery, who still warn their grandchildren about demons in the mountains who hunt men for sport. Myth or history? Legend or truth? Perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is that in the frozen hell of Korea in 1950, when modern armies clashed with modern weapons in a modern war, one man proved that survival doesn't care about doctrine, training, or approval. Survival cares about adaptation, about using what you have, about refusing to die, even when everything says you should. James Hale used a weapon that everyone mocked, that no military manual recognized, that had no place in modern combat. And with that weapon, he became something more than a soldier. He became a ghost story that armies tell to remind themselves that war is chaos. And chaos favors the prepared, the skilled, and the desperate. The bow still sits in the Smithsonian, waiting for someone to ask the question, what if we're wrong about what weapons matter? No one asks. The bow sits silent, its string removed for preservation, its wood dry and stable and harmless. But every year, on the anniversary of the Chongchon River withdrawal, a small group of Korean War veterans, growing smaller each year, gathers at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. They leave flowers. They tell stories. And some of them, the ones who were there, who saw what they saw in the darkness and the snow, they leave something else. They leave arrows. Small wooden arrows, hand-carved, with a single name burned into the shaft. Hale. It's their way of saying, we remember, we saw, we know what you did. And in the mountains of Kentucky, hunters sometimes report finding old arrows embedded in trees, perfectly preserved, the broadhead still sharp. They wonder who shot them, how old they are, why they're so far from any archery range. The locals know, though. The old-timers who remember Jimmy Hale practicing in his final years, keeping his skills sharp even when there was no war, no enemy, no mission except the memory of what he'd been. That's one of Hale's arrows, they'll say. He could hit a squirrel at 100 yards in the dark. Best hunter these mountains ever saw. They don't mention the other kind of hunting. The kind that made legends. The kind that no one ever forgets, no matter how many years pass. Because some legends are earned in blood. Some weapons prove their worth, not in firing ranges, but in frozen rice paddies at 3 in the morning. And some men, the ones who refuse to fit the mold, who trust instinct over training, who use what works instead of what's approved, become the stories that soldiers tell forever. James Hale was one of those men. They laughed at him once. No one ever laughed again.